and they will create in a way that is contrary to the law. Because any system of regulation that requires more than an hour to understand whether your creation is legal simply has failed. Now, at the end of this event, as I watched these lawyers listen to the puzzled questions, and as I suggested to them that they in fact were insane, they don't like it when I tell them they're insane, but I concluded there was really nothing we could say to the lawyers. There was no way to convince them that they would convince themselves that their system will work until the moment it collapses. And so the question we should be focusing on now is not so much how do we convince the law, but what do we do to move the law beyond this place where to create is to be a criminal, using the technologies that digital culture has produced. Well, so what would work in that? What would work to get them to change, get our system to change this understanding? Maybe nothing would work, right? I like pessimism. This is my favorite brand, is pessimism. So maybe I should tell you nothing here could possibly work. Let me tell you what I think will not work first. So one thing that won't work, at least in America, is the redoubled effort of hackers and technologists to break the system, to destroy DRM, to destroy systems that depend upon DRM. Not because DRM's good, it's not. We ought to eliminate DRM. But because we need to remember, in the way that these guys remembered, the extraordinarily irrational and brutal ways of the other side. We need to remember that, at least in the United States, there is no limit to irrational war. We will wage the most irrational war we can for what we believe is right, and it will only be after more are killed than could possibly make sense that we will stop that war, and so too here. We will wage in the United States this war to defend against those who would, quote, steal, as fully as America can, which of course is not perfectly, but it is strong enough to make the possibility of resistance through outright destruction not viable, in my view, to change this world. This is what we do all the time. We need to recognize it here. So that's first. Second, I don't think in the short term, that's like 20 years, we're going to see any hope in progressive legislation changing the way the system works. In fact, right now, it increasingly seems to me hopeless. This recent election is, I think, the best example of it. Many of us in the United States were very happy to see George Bush and his party soundly defeated in the midterm election. And we're so happy to see the Democrats come to power because, at least in many areas, the Democrats are at least sane. But in this area, the area of IP regulation, the Democrats are as insane as anybody is. And this man, someone we should refer to as Hollywood Howard, Howard Berman, the congressman from Hollywood, literally, is now the head of the most important intellectual property committee in the United States Congress. He is the most extreme member of Congress, and he is the most powerful member when it comes to intellectual property. And it's not just that he's in charge, it's that none of us, EFF, Public Knowledge, Free Software Foundation, none of us organized an outrage campaign about this extraordinarily outrageous election. None of us thought it was appropriate to question it because we take for granted that even our friends are our enemies. Even those we trust most with the most important issues don't yet get this. And so the idea that we will go forward and change through Congress, this insanity of regulation is just not going to happen. And finally, litigation. We liberals, especially liberal law professors, love the idea that whenever there's any wrong in America, we will just race to the courts and get them to correct it. Right? Here's evidence that I believe that. There's me, racing to the United States Supreme Court, challenging the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act, because of course any principled court would recognize that when the Constitution says copyrights are for a, quote, limited time, Congress can't just extend that limited time whenever it wants. Of course the courts would get that. But of course, 7-2, the United States Supreme Court said, no, there's no problem here, go ahead, whatever, you know, they've done it forever, they can do it forever again. 7-2 symbolizes, in my view, The fact that these courts don't yet understand this issue either. And more importantly, strategies that are focused on courts are long-term losing strategies. We have got to convince not 100 judges. We've got to convince 100 million people about the rightness of our position. Yes, and you too, right. Okay, so if it's not revolution and it's not legislation and it's not litigation, what will we do? What would work? Okay, so let's go back a bit. Once upon a time, there was something called broadcasting in the United States. Broadcasting of radio. And though we don't like to romanticize broadcasters much, they're not the heroes anymore, broadcasters at those times were basically held hostage. They were held hostage by content owners, in the United States represented by one collecting society, ASCAP. ASCAP had an exclusive to the most popular music in the world and in America, and ASCAP exercised the power of that exclusive to basically raise the rates of access to music to broadcasters by about 450% over an 8-year period. Broadcasters were upset with this, especially when in 1939 they announced they were going to double rates in 1940. So in 1939, a young lawyer named Sidney Kay started something called the Broadcast Music Incorporated. It was meant to be a competitor, BMI, with ASCAP. And its first important difference was that it was much more democratic in the musicians that it would permit. ASCAP had a rule that you had to have 5 hits before you could join the society. That meant that new forms of music, like rock and roll, couldn't have entered that form of collecting society. So they were much more open about who they would allow in. But the really clever thing that Sidney Kay did was that BMI began to make arrangements of public domain music and give them away for free to any affiliate of a BMI institution. So in 1940, when ASCAP doubled the rates for access to music, a majority of radio stations in the United States jumped ship and joined BMI. ASCAP said, we don't care. I mean, the people are going to revolt against that. They don't have access to the best music. They're going to say, forget it, and they're going to take their dollars and they're going to go to a different radio station. But in fact, they didn't. They didn't care much. Right? Music was music for them, and in 1941, ASCAP was cracked. They went to rates that were below the rates they had set in 1937. Now, the important thing is, even though BMI's content was second best, even though it wasn't the most popular content that was out there, the power BMI had was enough to crack the most powerful collecting society ordering rights in the United States. Now, the thing we should recognize, I think, is that the internet is today's broadcasters. We're facing the same struggle. Content owners, not just through a collecting society, but also now through corporations that control an extraordinary range of content, are trying to leverage their control over content into control over the business models and technology of digital environments. Through lawsuits, for example, the IFPI has sued 20,000 Germans since 2004 for downloading music illegally, according to them. MySpace is now facing this absolutely baseless lawsuit from Universal, threatening them whenever kids put content up in MySpace without paying Universal. YouTube, it's alleged, had to reserve 1/3 of its purchase price to cover the costs that lawyers would impose upon them because of what YouTube does. The point is, the same question is being confronted by internet technologists as was confronted by broadcasters. How do we free the future from the dead hand of the past? What do we do to make it so they can't control how technology develops? Well, one possible answer is to try to figure out what we could do in the model of BMI. We can't do technically the same thing. When BMI was around, the average term of copyright was about 28 years, so taking stuff from the public domain wasn't really taking stuff that was very old. For example, all of the Beatles would be in the public domain today if we lived under that same system. The average copyright now is about 95 years. So the ability to use the public domain as a club to force some rationality in the system doesn't exist. So how can we build alternatives on the lesson of BMI? Remembering the lesson of BMI is even second best is enough. Well, here's an alternative. You won't be surprised to know that I think one component of this alternative has something to do with an organization called Creative Commons. Right? So Creative Commons is, from this standpoint, simply infrastructure to a free culture. We provide simple ways for authors to mark their content with the freedoms they intend their content to carry. So the content lives on the net no longer under this all rights reserved model, but instead under a some rights reserved model, signaling the freedoms that run with the content up front and automatically in a machine readable way. As we've spread this project, launched in the United States in 2002, internationally, countries have adopted the Creative Commons license by porting the license into their local jurisdictions. More than 70 are doing this right now. This is the world as it exists right now. The green countries have already ported. The yellow countries are going to port in the next 6 months, and the red countries are still to be included in this process. But as these countries have ported the licenses, the uptake of these licenses has grown dramatically. So in the first year, we had about 1 million linkbacks to our licenses. At year 2, that number was at about 12 million. At year 3, which was last December, the number was at about 45 million. And the number at the end of this year will be over 150 million linkbacks to the licenses, meaning 150 million places on the net where objects are referring to the freedoms that Creative Commons licenses will guarantee. That's infrastructure. It's infrastructure supporting a sharing economy, protecting at least the desires of those who are participating in that sharing economy. That's part one. But part two is something that we've just begun to announce and show this month, a new way to use metadata in the infrastructure that we're building to link the sharing and commercial economies, to produce the opportunity for people to live in a kind of hybrid space where for the sharing economy their stuff is free, but if their creative work is to be used in a commercial space, there's a simple way to clear and understand what the permissions are for that to work. So for example, if you go into MySpace right now, you can find this guy, Gary New Vision, an artist. I won't testify as to his creative merit, but what's really creative is the way that he's begun to deploy his rights. So he's giving away non-commercial rights here. If you click on the CC icon, you're brought to our Commons deed, but the new feature of the Commons deed is a simple place to click through to some other place, never run by Creative Commons, nothing Creative Commons profits from, but another place where commercial rights to that music can be secured. Now this infrastructure, this metadata infrastructure is general. You can provide a link to anything. It could be rights, CDs, shirts, tips. It could even be links to other kinds of licenses. So for example, you could say, if you're not happy with the buy non-commercial license that I've given you, saying you can use this for non-commercial purposes, then I'll give you an option of also living under the copyleft share-alike license. It's an alternative license this would be available under. The point is that anything beyond the particulars given by that license can be added. Okay. Now take the first part I described, licenses that facilitate this infrastructure for the sharing economy. Add the second part, technology that facilitates the crossover between the sharing economy and the commercial economy, and begin to see something of how this infrastructure for an alternative can be built. What it needs here is to be used in a particular way. And our work here is to build it so that it can be used by enabling first the interoperability among licenses created by different organizations like the Free Software, FDL, and other licenses that might be within the family of free licenses, and that this infrastructure get integrated into existing technology, so where creativity is built, It's simple to mark the freedoms for that creativity and to inspire those who want to make a next billion